today's video, we're going to talk about the preterite versus the imperfect. When you're using both in different contexts together, we need to know the rules on how they work, when to use each tense. So this will not go over conjugations. You'll have to see the other videos on just the preterite and imperfect for that, but it will go over the uses of the two tenses. So when to use the preterite. What are the preterite tense uses? When is it used? For completed actions in the past, so I studied yesterday, or a series of completed actions, so think a list, and then actions that happened a set number of times or for a set duration in the past. Now let's see some examples of those. For completed action, when you think translation, think I talked on the phone yesterday with that completed ed at the end. So yo hablé con María ayer. I spoke with Maria yesterday. The action is done. It's completed. Ayer tells me that. This will have some lovely trigger words to let you know that the actions are done. Things like yesterday, last night, this morning. Then we move to a series of completed actions. Same thing, but now a list format. So you're going to have multiple items. So first, I woke up. Second, I got up. Then, I walked to school. A series of completed actions, but in a list format. They're all done. Then we've got duration and a number of times. So let's start with duration. Yo estudié por 2 horas. I studied for 2 hours. For is your best friend here, por, because that gives us for how long something happened. But for number of times, yo estudié una vez. I studied once. So the singular, or yo estudié 5 veces. I studied 5 times. Remembering that z becomes c, add the es to make vez plural, kind of like lapis. Alright, let's check out the imperfect. So the imperfect has its own set of uses. So this is kind of like the start of a play, the italicized section when you're reading, and it gives you all the background information. It sets the scene. That's kind of what the imperfect does for us. Got this acronym to remember the uses, WATCHDEP, that my Spanish teacher taught me once upon a time. Now these are all the things we need the imperfect for when we don't know for how long they happen. So weather, llovía mucho. Age, tenía 6 años. If you want to state the time like what's on a clock, you need the imperfect. Eran las 5, it was 5 o'clock. Now continuous action, that's just a really fancy way of saying something was or were and an ing. So just fancy ing. Yo estudiaba, I was studying. You just get that from the imperfect conjugation. There's no special words for it. Habitual action is just a fancy way of saying used to or would. So yo estudiaba con frecuencia, I used to study frequently. Then description and location, easy enough. Something like era muy grande, it was very big, just a general description. General emotions, estaba triste, he or she was sad. Physical mental state, estaba cansado. Or position, tenía una tortuga. All of these things in WATCHDEP need the imperfect because they're all generalized things that set the scene. But if you're given a time frame, this is all null and void. So if I said it rained for 2 hours, now I have to use the preterite, not the imperfect, because I set a start and a stop to the action. So be very careful with these. Okay, let's talk about these vocab terms for emotion, physical, and mental states. They'll cue us in that the imperfect's used. So a star is used with emotions like sad and happy, but also states of being like tired, estar cansado. Parecer means to seem, cansado, tired again, mal, bad. Pensar, to think. Querer is to want, and that's going to come up more later. Sentirse is to feel, so to feel well or sick here. And then we've got tener that can be used as to be in Spanish. So tener calor is to be hot. Then we've got frío for cold, hambre, hungry, sed, thirst, so to be thirsty, and sueño, to be sleepy. All of these represent emotion, physical, and mental states. So they have to use the imperfect most of the time. Alright, let's talk about HABER. You've seen this verb before, but maybe not as an infinitive. You might have seen it as I, like there is or there are in the present tense. These are the past tense versions of HABER. So we've got había and hubo. And they both have their specific uses, and they mean something different depending on what tense they use. Now, regardless, they translate as there was or there were. In the past, again, was or were for haber. But if you work with había, you're talking about descriptions in the past. So an example would be, había muchas personas allí. There were a lot of people there. Just a general description. But hubo is for events that took place. So hubo un terremoto. There was an earthquake being an event, so therefore we had to use hubo. So haber, again, there was or there were, but what tense you choose ultimately decides what you're saying in the sentence. So descriptions have to use había, just like había muchas personas allí. And for hubo, it's an event that took place, like hubo un terremoto. There was an earthquake. So event versus description, and that's just something that you need to memorize when to use each of these verbs. So haber in the past tense. Other very specific verbs that change meaning. Based on whether you use the preterite or the imperfect, these verbs in blue have different meanings. So what tense you choose for these determines the meaning in the sentence. And this is just something to memorize. So conocer in the imperfect means used to know or knew someone or some place. But in the preterite, you're talking about the moment, so it's met or became acquainted with instead. Saber, used to know or knew a fact, ongoing. But in that moment, again, it means found out. Then we get to poder and querer. These get a little more complicated. Poder has some positive and negative connotations. So in preterite, it means manage to if it's positive. But in a negative sentence, it means you tried something and you failed. But then when we get to the imperfect, if it's an affirmative sentence, it means you had the ongoing ability to do something. You're always able to. But in the negative, you never tried to do something, you just assumed you weren't going to be able to. Then with querer, we've got that same level of specificity again. When we get to the imperfect, if it's positive or negative, it's you did or you did not want to do something. But in the preterite, if it's positive, you wanted to do something in a specific moment. If it's negative, you refuse to do something. So again, these verbs are very specific and you need to memorize them. Also, these verbs that I'm boxing in red, they're all irregular in the preterite tense, so you're going to want to make sure that you look up their conjugations prior to using them because the spellings are really funky. Use an online dictionary. Alright, now let's talk about joining words, because these you'll see a lot with these two tenses. Let's start with mientras. Mientras means while, and it joins two parts or two clauses. You could either have two imperfect verbs, one in each clause. That means you've got two ongoing actions. So I was studying while you were reading. The two actions don't have anything to do with one another. They're both INGs, and I think of them as parallel lines. The other scenario that you could have is having one verb as the imperfect and the other in the preterite. One action was ongoing, but then something interrupted. So I think of it as a line for the ongoing portion. So I was studying, and then the interruption when the phone rang. The interruption is going to be the preterite. It happened in that moment. That's one way to use mientras. Now, cuando works kind of the same. When. Notice there's no accent because it's in a sentence. So, same thing, one ongoing action. That's the imperfect. And the preterite would be an interruption like we just had in the mientras scenario. So, I was walking when it rained. As in, it started to rain that moment. Again, these could switch order. You might not have the preterite second. It could go first, like when the phone rang, comma, I was studying. Then we could have two preterite verbs. Now, if you have both verbs in the preterite and they're conjugated, that tells us two different scenarios could happen. It means two actions finished at the same time, like I closed my book when you turned off the TV. Or one action is the result of another action. So that's more along the lines of like the cat jumped when the door slammed. Because the door slammed, the cat jumped. Two things that happened in the moment, one being the result of the other. And that's why you have preterite and preterite. Now again, the orders are not always the same here for these ones that could have either or. So be aware that these could flop. And that's our brief overview of the preterite versus the imperfect and some of the general uses of each tense and when to use each one, as well as special things to look out for with the verb HABER, joining words like MIENTRAS and CUANDO, and verbs that change meaning based on what tense they're in. Gracias, adiós.